Hi, everybody. We are hopping on a little bit early, but we're going to wait till a little after 4 to actually start. But thanks for joining us, and we'll talk a bunch more in a few more minutes. Hey, once again, we're here a little bit early, but we'll start right around 4. But I'm Catherine Johnson. I'm a consultant with AFSC right now, but used to be an employee for about 4 years, worked in the Office of Public Policy. So yeah, we're just going to wait a few minutes to let some more people join. But thanks so much for all of you for joining. And while we're waiting, a couple people have already started to do this. I think some people have seen these before. If you could drop where you're joining us from in the chat, that'd be great. So we can see where people are watching from. One person just asked about sound. Are the rest of you able to hear us?
Can you hear me as well?
Okay.
It's like we've got people joining from Concord, from Redford, Brooksville in Florida, Davenport in Iowa.
Indiana, although not really by choice. I think a lot of people right now are in places where they don't want to be, unfortunately. So again, we're going to wait just a couple more minutes so people can join, but we'll start a minute or two after the hour. Thanks so much for everybody for joining. We've got 33 people on, which is great. Wonderful. It's good to see really punctual people as a Capricorn. I appreciate that. But again, I'm Catherine, consultant with AFSC, former staff, and we'll be starting this in 1 or 2 minutes.
And I'm Lane, and I'll be joining Catherine for this Facebook Live. And for everyone just joining us, let us know in the chat where you're calling in from. And if you're looking for something extra to do in the next 60 seconds before we start, I recommend going to afsc.org/freethemall so you can check out everything that we have going on right now.
Heard somebody talking about the Brooklyn's Friends School. I have a lot of friends that are up in arms about that as well. Some union busting. It's really unfortunate to see. Let's see, we've got somebody from Brooklyn. Where else? Well, I should say I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm here in my house in northeastern D.C. up near Catholic University.
And I'm joining from my apartment in Philadelphia. Should we go ahead and get started? It looks like we've got more than 50 people on the Facebook Live now.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, thank you all for joining. Really appreciate it. It looks like some of you have been on these before. This is the American Friends Service Committee's Facebook Minis, and we're doing these every Thursday at the same time. And each week, AFSC brings on different AFSC staff to talk about the work that they're doing. And so I am actually currently a consultant with AFSC. My name is Catherine Johnson, but I used to be staff. I used to work at AFSC I worked for about 4 years in the Office of Public Policy and Advocacy.
And I'm Lane Mullet. I'm the interim director of media relations for AFSC. And I also, when I'm not working for AFSC, have spent the last decade doing a lot of abolitionist and anti-prison organizing in Philly and across the state and sometimes nationally. So I'll be talking about that a little bit today as well.
So today, what we're going to talk about is we're in the middle of some really exciting days of action that AFSC has put together. They're days of action to free them all. And so it's great that we have this Facebook meeting in the middle of them. And so we'll talk some about what those days of actions are and why we're doing them, what they involve and all of that. But also, these days of action are specifically focused on the abolition of the carceral systems that hurt our community so much across the United States. And so this week, we really wanted to talk about some of AFSC's history as an abolitionist organization and how this campaign and these days of action fit within that, but also explain some of what does that mean? When we say abolition, what does that actually mean concretely? So first of all, like I said, these are part of the days of action to free them all. And they were timed to coincide with the 49th anniversary of an uprising in the Attica prison up in New York. When brave folks who were imprisoned there in Attica stood up and demanded that their rights be respected, that the horrific conditions that they're being held under be changed, and that people be freed. And so we're doing these days of action to honor them and the many, many people across the United States right now that are standing up, both from within the walls of centers and prisons and without. And so as part of those days of action, we've got several online events, and I hope some of you were able to join some of the earlier ones we had, the webinar we had earlier in the week. We also have a call to worship at the very end of the week, but we also have local events all across the country that people can join. And we really hope that you'll check those out. If you go to afsc.org/freethemall, and we'll drop that link in the chat, you can see a ton of resources there about what does it mean? What is this abolition movement? What is this abolition movement? What does abolition mean? All of the events across the country, different kinds of action that you can take to demand that people be freed from jails, prisons, and detention centers. And this campaign we've got these days of action that go through the 13th, but we really have events throughout the month. So even if you can't do anything this week, be sure to check it out. And then this campaign is going to go on. Like I said, it's part of AFSC's dedication to abolition. And so this is going to be going on for quite a while, so be sure to check it out. So then back to, what is abolition? What do we mean when we say that? And with that, I'll hand it over to Lane.
That's a great question, Catherine. And it's a question we've been getting a lot ever since we started organizing under the hashtag Free Them All, which started towards the beginning of the pandemic, when we realized just how dangerous prisons, jails, and detention centers were for people who are incarcerated there during COVID-19, when they aren't able to safely socially distance and don't have access to even basic sanitation supplies, or often have access to public health information. But especially in this last week, as we've been talking a lot more on sort of our national platforms about why we're calling to free them all, I've gotten a lot of emails, messages, and some phone calls of people saying, wait, but all? You really want to free everyone? Is this just a gimmick? Are you trying to get attention? And I think we wanted to come on the Facebook Live Mini today to say, yes, when we say free them all, we do mean free them all. And that doesn't mean we have the capacity to open up all the gates tomorrow, but what it does mean is that we want to build a world where human beings aren't kept in cages, and that we want to do what we can to work towards that world and start building that world now, even though we know that we're not going to get there tomorrow, or may not even get there in our lifetimes. We still want to engage in this struggle together. So I think that the two questions that abolitionists often get about what it would really mean to abolish prisons, jails, and detention centers are related questions. One is sort of the what about people who have committed serious acts of harm? And then the other question is, what will we do instead? So we're going to talk a little bit more about the sort of like, what do we do instead a little bit later on. But I think at its most basic, abolition is about building a world where our response to problems isn't incarceration, isn't caging people. And that sort of a lot of people talk about abolition as though it's sort of like a utopian vision, but I think part of what we're trying to get across with these days of action and with organizing in general is that abolition is much more practical than the current system. Because if we look at the rise of mass incarceration over the last 40 or so years, we have 2.3 million people right now who are in cages in the United States at a cost of around $80 billion. And at the same time, we still have high rates of gun violence. We still have militarism. We still have poverty. We still have addiction. We still have mental health crises. So if prisons are being sold to us as something that's supposed to keep us safe, they have an abject failure. And we need to do something new. And if they're actually not designed to keep us safe, which is part of what we're putting forward here, if instead they're designed to control poor people and people of color, then that's all the more reason why we urgently need to just start dismantling these systems now. And AFSC has been doing this work for a long time. Actually in 1978, the AFSC board passed a minute supporting abolition, and for the following decades, our programs have been working to support people doing organizing work on the inside. One of our organizers in California, Laura Mignani, was on the negotiation team for the Pelican Bay hunger strikes, people organizing around conditions, trying to abolish solitary confinement, and working to get people out who are serving life and long sentences. And these efforts by themselves won't lead to abolition, but we see these efforts towards decarceration as being part of working towards the world, part of bringing our friends and comrades and loved ones home out of those cages to be part of the struggle with us, with abolition as the long-term goal. But we don't just work in the prison system. There are lots of different carceral systems in the US, and I'm going to turn it back over to Catherine to talk a little bit more about immigration detention and AFSC's work there.
Thanks, Lane. So one thing that I think I forgot to say was if you have questions, a couple of people have already started to do this. If you have questions, please drop them in the chat. We'll leave some time at the end of this to get to your questions. As Lane said, AFSC, besides the work on prison and jails, has also worked on immigration detention for a long time. And so, as I mentioned, I was on staff with the American Friends Service Committee for about 4 years as their policy coordinator on immigration and U.S. policy toward Latin America. And during those 4 years, I continued AFSC's work condemning immigrant detention across the United States. Many AFSC programs work with people who are currently detained. And through that work, we've seen the horrific conditions in detention centers, both ICE detention centers and CBP ICE's Immigration and Customs Enforcement and CBP Customs and Border Patrol detention in the United States. These conditions have led to numerous deaths as people are denied health care, they're fed rotten food, they're often kept in very small and crowded spaces. There's also thousands of complaints of sexual and physical violence against immigrations and customs enforcement officers, many of which have gone uninvestigated. There's also been report after report showing gross medical neglect that leads to people's deaths directly while they're in custody. There are tens of thousands of people across the United States that are detained in different types of immigrant detention. And the only reason currently that there aren't more is because the Trump administration has callously stopped people from entering the country, even refugees, even asylum seekers, everybody, and has sent tens of thousands of people back to Mexico and back to Central America, where they're being preyed on by the very gangs that they're fleeing, where they have no access to asylum, to refugee status, etc. And so because of this, the situation in AFSC's history of work led us to decide to launch a campaign and take a position that immigration and customs enforcement should be abolished. And we took that position that it should be abolished and not just reformed, because ICE is part of a racist and xenophobic system within the Department of Homeland Security that was created in 2003, not that long ago. In my adulthood, it was created in response to 9/11 as part of the xenophobic backlash against immigrants in the United States. And so as ICE was created, it moved all of these pieces of immigration under Homeland Security, as if all immigrants, are a threat to the United States and our security. And so the very basis of this institution is that racist and xenophobic belief. And then the way that it's carried out its operations under Trump, but under previous administrations as well, has been violent, has been indiscriminate, and has hurt our communities. I've watched as people were dragged out of my neighborhood and quickly deported without any sort of due process. And I've seen the impact on my neighborhood, on the families around me. And our offices have seen this over and over again. And so that's what led us to say that this is not a system that can be reformed, because it's not a system that was ever designed to actually keep us safe. It was a system that was designed to feed these xenophobic reactionary waves after 9/11, and also a system to make substantial profit. Much of ICE detention, sometimes up to 3/4 of ICE detention, is actually private. And so it's big prison corporations, especially the GEO Group and Core Civic, but several others as well, who are profiting off of ICE detention and the detention of immigrants in these horrific conditions. But also counties, such as many of the counties right around Washington, D.C., where I am, also use detaining immigrants as a way to fill holes in their budgets. And we've seen people across the United States stand up and say, that, push back on their counties' decisions or their counties and states' decisions. Again, so all of this led us to say that we need to abolish ICE. And then the concrete mechanism that we sought to be able to do that is to use the appropriation system, which is why we launched our Defund Hate campaign to defund ICE and CBP completely. So then, again, we wanted to talk to you some about the alternatives, and so I'll pass it back to Lane for that.
Thanks, Catherine. So like I was saying, one of the biggest questions that abolitionists get all the time is, what do we do instead? And the reality is that there are so many ways that we can solve problems without putting people in cages. And we know that putting people in cages exacerbates harm and violence, perpetuates cycles of trauma, and because of the tremendous amount of cost associated with incarceration, also impoverishes communities, and means that those resources that states and governments are spending on incarceration can't get directed elsewhere. So rather than saying, rather than framing the question, what's the alternative to incarceration, I generally try to encourage people to say, what is it that we need to create healthy, safe, thriving communities? And starting our thinking from that way, rather than looking at a sort of like one-to-one, we'll switch our prisons out for, X, Y, or Z, to think that there are hundreds of things happening already that, as we build them up, can be things that keep our communities safe and healthy and thriving. I'll just touch on a few of those things really quickly, which, there could be a Facebook Live on each of these things individually, but this is just to get you thinking. So looking at transformative and restorative forms of justice to deal with harm in ways that look more towards root causes, more towards, actually addressing what happened and making sure that people's needs get met in the process of healing and accountability and transformation. Looking at ways that mediation and conflict resolution skills can be taught at all levels. So starting when we're really little, and a lifelong process of actually having those be just as critical as other life skills we might learn in school and at home. Free and easily accessible community-based addiction treatment and mental health services, critically important. Immigration systems that are based on welcoming people rather than building walls. Strong emergency response systems that don't involve the police. I know that's something that people have been thinking and talking a lot about over the last several months. Imagine if there actually was someone you could call when you needed help, or someone you loved needed help, without the risk of that person being shot. And with the possibility that there will be a good outcome, which is so rare when the police get involved. And then one of the biggest things that is an alternative to prison is the redistribution of resources so that people's basic needs are being met. So each of those things is huge, but there are also things that many, many different organizations and individuals are already working on at a smaller scale, and are already doing amazing things. So imagine if we had the resources that the system has, that the incarceration systems have, what we could build to keep our communities safer and healthier, and actually give people the opportunity to thrive and transform and be accountable when harm is caused. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Catherine to look at some of the questions that folks have been asking.
Well, one of the big questions that people has been asking is, if we get rid of prisons, what do we do? So that's great that you went over some of those. And I really encourage people to look at the explainer that we posted the link to in the chat, that it does go through a lot of why we say free them all, which includes some of the alternatives to the prison system. Otherwise, there was one question about rematriation. I don't believe AFSC is currently working on rematriation. But I would encourage you to go afsc.org to check out all of our other work that we're doing across the country and across the world. And be sure to drop any other questions you have in the chat. Are the things that we're saying making sense? Have we persuaded you? Do these alternatives sound like things that you would want to institute in your community? I know they certainly are things that I wish were available to me and my friends and family here in this community, instead of having to rely on violence and xenophobia to supposedly try to keep us safe.
And I see a comment in the chat about how addressing toxic masculinity can be part of addressing violence, and I just want to lift that up, that dismantling systems of oppression, both within ourselves and within the structures, institutions, and policies around us, is actually an extremely important anti-violence strategy. And that patriarchy and toxic masculinity can often be a barrier to people addressing harm in other ways.
So once again, I really encourage you all to go to our Free Them All website to look at all of the different ways that you can get involved in these days of action, the events that we have across the country, the different ways you can take action, the several different the sort of reading resources that we have as well. Oh, here's a question from Syra. Is there a concern when we name poverty as an underlying issue? We are not recognizing crimes by those with wealth. Lane, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think that's another great point. And I think that this sort of brings up for me the way that the category, what we often think of when we think of crime, is often a very racist and classist idea of what crime is. Because there are, say, white collar crimes are the, things that are illegal under our current system, but are so immoral, like taking people's land, like poisoning people's water, like the very act of putting people in cages itself, that are clearly causing harm on a massive scale, and that the perpetrators of those crimes are not only not being held accountable, they're being rewarded for committing them. So part of why we actually want to get away from the whole system of incarceration and the whole way that we think of crime and punishment in this country is that we believe it's foundationally flawed. And that when we start looking at harm and violence and scales of harm, the biggest perpetrators of harm to mass numbers of people are the state and corporate actors who are poisoning the land that we live on, that are taking resources away from people who need them, enclosing land, and acting with repression against, in particular, Black and brown people in this country.
So there's a question here about how much money is made from detaining immigrants and who's getting rich. So like I said, there's a few different private prison corporations. Actually, there's several different private prison corporations. A couple of really big ones are Geo Group and Core Civic. And so we know that they each make hundreds of millions of dollars. Another one here in my area is Immigration Corporation of America. And so they have a big contract down in Farmville and are trying to get more across the region. But like I said, the other sort of group that's getting rich off of this is counties. That since the sort of economic crisis since 2008, many counties have found that they have holes in their budget and they're using immigrant detention to fill that, unfortunately, which makes counties and cities, it makes these counties and cities complicit in these abuses that are committed within this system. There's another question about examples of places that have abolished police or prisons and how that's helped the community thrive. Elaine, do you want to take that?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that there's anywhere in the US that's like a large municipality that's successfully yet abolished police or prisons. But about the sort of abolishing police systems of policing, one thing that I often encourage people to think about is all of the places in their life where police and prisons aren't. I know for me, I grew up in a town of 800 people in a very rural area. And technically, state troopers had jurisdiction in that town, but they were never there, and there was no police force. And people were still able to call the police, and someone would come, but it would be a very long time. And it wasn't the end of the world. It wasn't even a radical community. It was a relatively conservative community, and we went about our lives okay without the intervention of the police. Neighbors worked together to solve problems. So I think that time will tell as we see these struggles to defund the police, as we see these struggles to decarcerate and to abolish prison and detention system, what kinds of systems we come up with. And I'm hoping that the coming decades will be a time of tremendous experimentation about what it means to keep each other safe and what it means to remake institutions geared towards public safety from the ground up.
Here's another question that I know you have a lot of thoughts on, Lane. Some authors that you can look to on the topic of abolition.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I actually meant to shout people out before, but there's so many great authors that you can look to. So this is apologies for all the excellent people I'm about to forget about. Please also, people who are tuning in, please drop the names of your favorite authors in the chat so others can see them. But Angela Davis has been doing prison abolition work for a very long time. Highly recommend all of her work. Ruth Wilson Gilmore is an amazing activist and scholar. Recently profiled in the New York Times Magazine if you want a nice accessible way to hear her talking about abolition before you plunge into Golden Gulag, which is much more academic, that was a seminal sort of work on the infrastructure of incarceration and how that sort of shapes the geography around us. Highly recommend Vicki Law, Avery Gordon, and then also on especially writing and thinking about transformative forms of justice, certainly Miriam Kaba, and many others who have done amazing work thinking about and actually building and documenting how we address serious harm and violence in our communities in abolitionist ways. I want to shout out the Creative Interventions Toolkit, which you can find online, which is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of concrete, practical support for how to deal with violence without calling the police. And there's a lot of great resources out there, and also a lot of great organizations. Critical Resistance has been carrying the torch of abolition for a really long time, and many of the people that I named who are working on as abolitionist scholars, also been really important figures in critical resistance and in building this, what I would say is now a thriving abolitionist movement across the country.
So one final reminder to be sure and go check out what's going on with our days of action. So that's at afsc.org/free them all. Find an event near you or online that you can attend, that you can tune into. We have so many people that are working on this issue across the country that can also share their experiences and their that'll be answering a lot of these questions as well. And be sure you can also there see different ways that you can take action. These days of action are really focused on getting as many people out of prisons, jails, and detention centers right now, because these systems are a public health crisis on their own, but it's exacerbated obviously by the COVID crisis, which has created each of these centers, turned all of them into death traps. So please go take action, find an event. And tune in again next week as AFSC will have their next Facebook Mini.
Thanks so much for joining us, everyone, and let's go abolish the prison system.
And I